Bom dia a todos. É com grande alegria que abrimos nosso Encontro Internacional de Estudos Mitopoéticos e com ele a segunda jornada de Estudos Mitopoéticos, com o título de O Senhor dos Anéis, 70 anos de A Sociedade do Anel. Eu gostaria de agradecer, embora ela não esteja aqui presente, a professora Maria Zilda da Cunha pela autorização do evento, também ao DLCV, o Departamento de Letras Clássicas e Vernáculas, especialmente o Júlio Fuji, que é o secretário do DLCV, que veio nos apoiando nesses longos meses. Eu também agradeço todos os meus amigos da equipe da Jornada de Estudos, aqui, de modo especial, a Giovana Chinelato, que está mediando a nossa mesa. E, para iniciar esse encontro, de modo especial, recebemos a professora Sørina Higgins. So, thank you, Sørina, for accepting to open our long-expected encounter. We are very delighted to have you here with us. Unfortunately, not in person. We tried to, but we couldn't get it. But even in a Tolkienian event, I can say we are grateful for the technology that brings us together. So it's such an honor for all of us. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. Bom dia. Muito obrigada. I'm very glad to be here.
Before your lecture, I would like to present you to Brazilian audience in Portuguese. And after that, Giovana will lead us in this session. Thank you, Sørina. Sørina Higgins é editora, escritora, professora de inglês e pesquisadora em literatura modernista britânica. Atualmente está escrevendo The Oldest Inkling, An Introduction to Charles Williams, com previsão de lançamento para esse ano pela Apocryphal Press. E ela é autora de From Thaumaturgy to Dramaturgy, Staging Occult Modernism. Editou uma coletânea em ensaios acadêmicos intitulada The Inklings and King Arthur. E como escritora está atualmente revisando o livro de contos Shall These Bones Breathe? E já publicou 2 antologias de poesia. Mora com o marido irlandês no norte do estado de Nova York, onde se digladiam com uma parelha de gatos, a algazarra das galinhas e diversos vegetais. A Sørina apresentará a palestra Time to Search, Temporal Narratives in Fantasy Literature. Thank you, Sørina. Feel free to get started.
Okay, thank you. I will. I really appreciate that introduction. Thank you, Chris and Gio. And I think you should all take that word for chickens and adopt it. What was it? Agosadia? You should use that for your collective noun for chickens because they do make a lovely mess. Well, thank you for inviting me to talk to you about temporal narratives in fantasy literature, a time to search. I once heard somebody claim that all stories can be summarized as either a stranger came to town or someone went on a journey. Of course, you could even say that those 2 plots are the same story, since the stranger who came to town was on a journey from somewhere else. This generalization suggests that all fantasy literature, indeed almost all literature, is driven by journeys, quests, and travels from one place to another, either physical or metaphorical or both. What is a journey except a movement through time and space? Someone starts out in one place at one moment and ends up in another place at a different moment, which is why the journey metaphor works so perfectly for mental, emotional, or spiritual changes, as well as physical travels. In either case, the point is that the character develops. They are not the same at the end of the quest as they were at the beginning. Even if the whole trip was in their mind, well, their body sat unmoving in a chair the entire time. Whether they passed through space, time, or both, they shifted somehow. But of course, a journey through space does not have to be linear. We don't always leave point A and end up at point B by going in a straight line across the shortest distance. We often take side quests, backtrack, or get lost, or find ourselves stuck along the way. Similarly, stories do not always present time as a simple chronology with everything happening in order. right? We get flashbacks, flash forwards. We might start at the beginning of the story and say, how did we get here? Or we might time travel, especially in fantasy and science fiction. So in this talk today, I will look briefly at two theories about narrative structure: Joseph Campbell's hero's journey that you're probably familiar with, and Farah Mendlesohn's taxonomy of fantasy. We'll also bring in a little bit of Mikhail Bakhtin's idea about the chronotope, which I'll define in a moment. We'll ponder how these approaches interact with time and setting together, and whether they change a reader's experience of moving through linear time. In other words, do they actually change the way the reader experiences chronology and moments? Next, I'll briefly present some time travel books by Tolkien and his friends in the Inklings, including a very important innovation by Charles Williams. Finally, I'll end with some thoughts about the time-bound nature of narrative and of consciousness itself, but also their ability to transcend time to some extent. So let's get into it. Here's a quote from physicist Brian Greene. "Planet Earth, which Carl Sagan described as a mote of dust suspended on a sunbeam, is an evanescent bloom in an exquisite cosmos that will ultimately be barren." And on this fleeting material reality, as the hours and days rush by, we tell stories to try to catch something and hold it, to try to grasp an experience or person or place and make it last by putting it into words. We tell stories as a way to fight against death. So what are these stories that we tell inside of time in our desperation to hold something? Well, the Oxford English Dictionary defines story as a narrative of imaginary or, less commonly, real events composed for the entertainment of the listener or reader. But it's more than that, right? Not just for entertainment. As historians and sociologists tell us, such as Joanna Macy, Chris Johnston, and Yuval Harari, stories are what people groups fight about today. Think about any conflict going on in the world today, whether it's geopolitical, local, national, politics, religion. They're all about a story that explains something, that gives something a meaning. And so people are fighting over their right to assert or promote or live within their meaning or their story. Brian Greene again says, "We are a species that delights in story. We look out on reality, we grasp patterns, and we join them into narratives that can captivate, inform, startle, amuse, and thrill." So both of those have used the word narrative, which of course is an account of a series of events or facts, etc., given in order, or are they? And with the establishing of connections between them. Now, the more technical literary critical definition of narrative is the part of a text, especially a work of fiction, which represents the sequence of events as distinguished from that dealing with dialogue or description. So the part that the narrator puts in other words, there's a bit of interpretation going on between the events, the characters, the places, and this narrative. The narrative is what makes sense and what puts the things into order, even if it's not chronological order. That's what a book does. As Joe Hoffman told me, it takes an arbitrary path through space-time and turns it into a linear path. It makes events into an artistic shape. Now let's look at that word chronotope, the term that Russian literary theorist Mikhail Bakhtin introduced. He used it to refer to the coordinates of time and space involved in a given narrative. In other words, to the setting considered as a spatiotemporal whole. I don't know about you, but I often think of the setting as being just the place and maybe the time period it's set in, right? Like if it's historical fiction, the time and place that it's set in, but I hadn't really thought of it as the passage of time through the story as well. But that's what Bakhtin wants us to think about. It is the warp and weft of space and time which forms the background tapestry of a fictional narrative. And that makes sense to me. If we think about The Lord of the Rings, for example, the place is obviously essential, Middle Earth. We often judge a Tolkien adaptation by saying whether or not we felt that we visited Middle Earth in that adaptation. but the time is essential too, whether that's the historical Earth period that he's sort of reimagining, or whether it's the amount of time that's passing in the story and its effect on the characters. Quite frequently, when something is difficult or challenging, or when there's suffering in the story, it's because something goes too fast or takes too long. So here's a little bit more about the chronotope. It is the complex nexus of realistic, or apparently realistic, right, space and time, which reaches directly into the narrative. Locations and actions in time take place against this backdrop. It's sort of like the spatiotemporal archetype of setting that determines the kind of archetypal characters, situations, and stories that can realistically emerge from the matrix formed by the intersection of particular geographies and particular periods of time. That's the chronotope. And the kinds and structures of chronotopes are almost endless, from simple, straightforward tellings in order, according to the classical unities, right? One plot, one place, one day, as Aristotle wanted us to use in drama. Or a chronotope might be a convoluted, complex time structure in a postmodern novel. For example, I read a couple of scholars who were searching for a model for a post-classical chronotope. And they looked at, for example, both Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway, which is confined to one day, but is structured by the character's movements in space. And they looked at Amor Towles' A Gentleman in Moscow, which is restricted to a single location, but encompasses 32 years of time. So those are two very different literary chronotopes. And they use that term to study the complexity of temporal and spatial relationships, which is what I hope to keep doing in a very basic way with fantasy here. So what is this time that they keep talking about? What is time? Among other things, it is, according to the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy, apparently the most frequently used noun in the English language. I don't know if this is true of the equivalent word in Portuguese. Maybe somebody can look that up, the frequency of nouns for time in your language. The Oxford English Dictionary has many, many definitions for time. Here are the most relevant for us today. Duration, conceived as beginning and ending with the present life or the material universe, or the sphere within which human affairs are contained. Finite duration as distinct from eternity, the duration of the world or the universe. I found it kind of surprising how philosophical and even almost religious that Oxford English Dictionary definition gets. But it's hard to talk about time in the abstract without getting into your theories of what it means to be human and of our possible ongoing existence and whether there's more than the material universe, which Tolkien, of course, thought about in all of his writings. Another definition from the OED for time is indefinite continuous duration, regarded as that in which existence and the sequence of events takes place. The abstract entity which passes, goes by, or is consumed as events succeed one another. And they have a definition, chiefly for science fiction. Time viewed as a medium through which travel into the past or future is hypothesized and imagined to be possible. According to physicists, time is the fourth dimension. It can expand and contract, and it only moves in one direction. When we read a story, we temporarily leave our own linear experience of time and plunge into the chronology of the point of view character or characters. In about 5 hours of reading time, we can cover 421 days in The Hobbit. It can take us about 40 hours of reading time to get through the 1.5 years of the main events of The Lord of the Rings. Or we can spend 27 hours listening to the audiobook of James Joyce's Ulysses and only get through 1 day of the character's life, a little bit more than real time. Or in only about 15 hours of fast reading, we can live 10,000 years in the novel Sauron by Edward Rutherford. When Rip Van Winkle falls asleep for 20 years, we, the readers, skip ahead and miss those 20 years. When the main character in The Time Machine by H.G. Wells shoots ahead or goes back, we zoom ahead and back in time with him. I haven't yet read Trilogy, Patterns of Contact by Jorge Luis Calife, but we know that in it, the triad has to go back in time to intervene in human evolution. We can go along with this alien being by reading the book, right? Right? We can travel with these characters through time, or do we? Really, we're sitting in a chair turning pages, or driving in a car listening to an audiobook, or whatever you do while you're listening to an audiobook, for only the real, actual primary world number of minutes it takes to get through the book. The mundane, perhaps depressing reality is that we do not travel in time any more than usual while we're reading. Minutes pass as they always do. It's 8:14 a.m., then it's 8:15 a.m., then it's 8:16 a.m. No matter how quickly or slowly time is passing in the book, or how long it takes me to read it, or how much the main character may jump ahead to the future and look back in the past. The fantasy of time travel is merely that, just fantastical and totally unrealistic. Time is fixed and always moves ahead 60 seconds to the minute, 60 minutes to the hour, no matter what we do. Or is it? In theory, writes Michael Marshall, it is possible for space-time to be folded like a piece of paper, a wrinkle in time, allowing a tunnel or a wormhole to be punched through. On our current understanding of the universe, we could potentially travel into the future, physicists conclude. But traveling into the past may well be a total no-no. However, when astronomers look into deep space with their telescopes, they are literally, non-figuratively seeing the past because of the time it takes light to travel from another galaxy to ours. There's also Richard Feynman's idea that positrons could simply be represented as electrons going from the future to the past in a back section of their world lines. So if we wanted to time travel, all we'd need to do is add another path to that electron. And I guess be an electron ourselves, which is a slight complication. But all this is to say that maybe time travel is literally theoretically possible according to the physicists, but fantasy writers have always done this, regardless of the constraints of physical reality. And they have done so in certain types of stories. So let's take a look at some of the types of stories that they may have used. You may all be familiar with the main idea of Joseph Campbell's influential 1949 book, The Hero with 1,000 Faces. It postulates that stories follow roughly the same structure. We have our hero. He gets a call to adventure. He finds supernatural aid. At some point, he might resist the call and go back and have to be persuaded to take on his mission. He comes to some kind of a threshold that he has to cross. Once he does cross the threshold, it's the beginning of transformation. He might have a mentor to lead him on, a sort of Jedi Master, Merlin, or Gandalf figure. He may have a helper, and he goes through many challenges and temptations. Eventually, he plunges into some kind of abyss, an underworld, a hell, some sort of dark land, some terrible confrontation, and goes through a death and rebirth, either literal or spiritual. He's transformed, has some kind of redemption, maybe has an encounter with a seductress or a goddess, gets a gift, and eventually achieves his quest or his goal and returns, but forever changed. Now, I used the masculine he throughout that because the heroine's journey is a slightly different story. But the hero's journey is so common that many people have said every story has to follow that structure. And look, remember when I said at the beginning there are only two plots, which are really just one? The hero's journey is obviously describable as someone goes on a journey. But what if the character time travels at some point? Doesn't that mess this up? Well, no, because the time travel fits quite neatly into the crossing of thresholds and the challenges that the hero faces. It doesn't matter how many different time periods he visits, they're part of his temptations, his obstacles, his adventures, and his ultimate transformation. And in any case, He moves through time in a linear fashion from his point of view, no matter how many eras he may visit. Suppose he goes to the future on Tuesday and goes to the past on Wednesday. From his point of view, he's still experiencing his Tuesday, then the future, then his Wednesday, then the past in a linear fashion. And the reader is experiencing it like that along with him. A good question is whether Campbell's narrative structure is universal for all stories or for all fantasy stories. Well, I'm sure you've read some that try to break this structure. And if you want to put them in the chat while you think of them, please do. Here's an example. The story called Stories of Your Life and Others by Ted Chiang. It was adapted into the film Arrival. I don't know if any of you have seen that. This linguist encounters an alien race that has a different concept of time. And by contact with them, she gets a different conception of time, such that she remembers the future. So you might say that that story breaks Campbell's structure, but not really, because our main character still is her ordinary self at the beginning, takes on this challenge to do this translation, has all these encounters that transform her and lead her to make an extremely important decision. Okay, what about the infamous modernist play Waiting for Godot by Samuel Beckett? It has been called a play in which nothing happens twice, because you just have two guys waiting around. They never go anywhere. They're never on a journey. They're never transformed. But the plot in each of the two acts does follow a structure where a stranger comes to town. Two other characters come in and interact with them and have conflict and discuss things and move on. So, a brilliant discussion on Reddit, that source of excellent scholarly information. A person writing under the lovely name of Galactic Sausage answered this question: well, can anything ever break Campbell's structure? And he wrote, well, here's the basic structure. There's a character, they want something, some stuff happens, they do or don't get the thing, and there's a denouement. It's kind of impossible to avoid, or you don't really have a story. And I think that he makes a good point, that if you're going to boil the structure down to that, that is what makes a story: a beginning, a middle, and an end. A setup, a bunch of stuff happens, and eventually it gets resolved, even if the resolution is that nothing gets resolved. The narrative resolves, even if the plot or the character's problems don't. So let's go from that general theory to talk more specifically about fantasy now through Farah Mendlesohn's taxonomy of fantasy. She is concerned with how the fantastic enters the text and what the reader's relationship is to that secondary imagined world. But I'm interested in slightly different questions. How does each of her categories present the sequence of events? Are there particular chronotopes associated with each of her categories? If so, do they change a reader's experience of moving through linear time? As Michal Bakhtin notes, time and space in literature are always elaborated differently depending on the cultural and historical development of society. So there's another interesting question that I will not get into today about how fantasy literature displays time-space differently depending on the time-space cultural realities of its author. As Dimitra Fimi writes, I suggest that one of the most fundamental things that fantasy literature does when presenting us with imaginary worlds or reconfigurations of our world is to challenge, to question, to redefine, to understand, to grapple, and eventually come to terms with concepts of space and time. And one reason is because fantasy literature distorts space and time in impossible ways. In any of them, the author can build a coherent and fully realized alternative world with its own chronology and geography. Okay, so let's get into Mendelssohn's 4 categories of fantasy. 1, portal fantasy, portal or quest fantasy. Someone from our world enters the fantastic through a door, and we go along with their perspective. She says it delightfully that we ride on their shoulder, so we see what they see. And it's usually a quest narrative. It can always be described as someone goes on a journey, even if the journey is just from our world through the portal into that other world. The fantastic has to be navigated by our point of view character. They have to figure out what this world is, how it works, and usually what it needs. They are often called upon to find something, fix something, rule something, to solve a problem in the secondary world. And there's a constant sense of wonder. So we get introduced to the fantastic along with Lucy, Bilbo, Frodo, Alice, whoever it may be who's going through the portal. So Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, The Hobbit, Lord of the Rings to some extent, right? We're plunged into Middle Earth, but in the Shire, which is sort of analogous to our world, and then we have to leave it along with Frodo. Lev Grossman's The Magicians trilogy, these are examples of portal fantasy, and they're all medieval romances in which someone wanders into fairy or fairyland, which has a time of its own. So there's sort of two chronotopes that are interacting in portal fantasy. One is that the narrative is forward moving. It's usually fairly quick and linear, journey from our world through the portal into their world, through it, achieving the quest, mastering, conquering, changing the secondary world. But also, it can construct a doorway into an other world or dimension with a different concept of time. So that world could have its own concept. Second category, immersive fantasy. This is where the fantastic is what's normal, and the reader gets plunged into the middle of it, into an assumed realism. The Silmarillion, for instance. Nobody goes through from our world, we just start there. Watership Down, Wheel of Time, the Broken Earth series by N.K. Jemisin. In Watership Down, for instance, the invasion of humans into their home warren sends them out on a journey. This kind of fantasy can offer us a hidden, invisible world somewhere around us with its own historical traditions and spaces that we cannot access. Mendelssohn's third category is intrusion fantasy, when the fantastic invades our world and brings chaos. Lots of explanation is needed. Think of Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. Any of Charles Williams' novels, they take place in ordinary England and the supernatural breaks in. This invasion can mess with time. It can present a version of our world in which supernatural forces erupt and challenge every sense of here and now. Her fourth category is liminal fantasy, in which the reader is estranged from a type of fantastic world that is familiar to the protagonist, but we're always a little unsure of what goes on. We spend the entire work inside the portal, dancing on the threshold. We're willing to believe or suspend disbelief, but we're unsure of what to believe in. We're disoriented and estranged, and the magic hovers in the corner of our eye. My favorite example of this is a novel called Little Big by John Crowley. I don't know if any of you have read it. The vast, multi-layered, fluid, slippery sense of space and time occurs in this type of fantasy literature and in many others. Okay, so we've got these different categories. As we finish up, we'll look very briefly at Tolkien and his Inklings friends and how they interacted with time travel. You may know that at one point, C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien flipped a coin to see which of them would write space travel and which of them would write time travel. Lewis got space and wrote the Space Trilogy, I think better called the Ransom Cycle. Well, Tolkien niggled on and on and on and on with the Notion Club papers and never finished it. He often wanted to write an epic fantasy time travel work in which his main character would time travel through dreams or sort of visionary spiritual experiences, would go back to these earlier eras, but he never finished it. However, it could be argued that Lord of the Rings is a time travel story. According to Joe Hoffman, the Shire is Edwardian, Bree is Tudor England, Arnor more broadly is medieval, Rohan is Anglo-Saxon, Minas Tirith might be Roman Egypt, the dwarves' cultures are Neolithic, but then in the Dead Marshes, we come back to the trenches of World War I. Orthanc is a 20th century industrial complex, and Mordor is a 20th century military industrial complex gone wrong. So This is a palimpsest of chronotopes, according to Feeney, and they're woven together into a tapestry that feels coherent. It's the sort of fantasy that plays with space and time by hybridizing historical cultures and creates a complex mosaic of geopolitical concerns. Now, C.S. Lewis, as I said, wrote his space travel story very quickly, but seeing as Tolkien wasn't publishing a time travel novel very soon, Lewis thought he'd try his hand at that too. And so he started The Dark Tower, which he never finished, and the fragment was published after his death. He writes straight up about time travel in it, and I think it's worth reading a couple of quotes, even though I have somewhere from 1 to 3 minutes left, depending on when we got started. So the character says, the sort of time traveling you read about in books, time traveling in the body, is absolutely impossible. Time traveling clearly means going into the future or the past. Now, where will the particles that compose your body be 500 years in the future? They'll be all over the place, some in the earth, some in plants and animals, some in the bodies of your descendants. So you won't be able to travel in your body because all matter will be used up. So instead they create a chronoscope, like a telescope or a microscope, to look into time. Therefore, in the novel, we get to see these other time periods, even though it would be impossible for us to travel there in the body. Finally, Charles Williams, in his 1931 novel, Many Dimensions. This novel presents what I believe is the first ever instance, at least in European, Western English language works, of a time loop, of someone stuck in a time loop. There was a novel in 1915 that had somebody who got to go back and live his life a second time, but it wasn't a loop. There was, that Wikipedia gives as the earliest example of a time loop, the episode The Man Who Murdered Time, in the radio drama The Shadow in 1939. However, in 1931, Williams wrote a time loop. So I think he invented it. There's a magical stone that brings you anywhere, anywhen you want. And the wicked character informs a lab assistant that the stone will let him travel back in time. So this guy uses a stone to wish himself back 12 hours in the past. So he goes back 12 hours, but then of course, when he gets to now again, he just wishes again to go back over and over forever. So it takes supernatural intervention to break him out of the time loop. Now, of course, the problem here is that time travel makes no sense. Most of the stories employing time travel in popular culture are logically incoherent, writes one scholar. One cannot change the past to be different from what it was, since the past only occurs once. And the problem is that if we're going to read it, we, the reader, have to experience it twice. A quick example, Harry Potter 3. They go through the story and events are a certain way. They think they see Buckbeak executed, all these terrible things happen. Then they get the time turner and they go back and they go through the story the second time, watching themselves. You don't get two of the same timeline, but in order for it to be a narrative plot, we have to go through it twice. So the very fact of narrating the time travel makes it an impossible paradox. So aren't we just time-bound and there's no way to get out of it? It doesn't matter how much we read or write fantasy, we're just stuck. We still experience things 1 minute after another. We never experience going back, really. We're stuck in our own time. But then again, maybe not, because in our minds, in our imaginations, we can experience 2 times at once. Think about rereading a book. You can be reading chapter 1 and simultaneously remembering chapter 10 or chapter 100, so that you can be experiencing both times at once and experiencing your own time around you as you're sitting in your room and the cat walks by or whatever else happens, right? Or you have to put the book down and come back to it. So we read fantasy to satisfy many desires. I think one is we want to escape from the 1 minute after another nature of linear time. Borges famously wrote, "I deny the existence of a single time in which all things are linked as in a chain. And we will end with a quote from Borges, who says, "Denying temporal succession, denying the self and the astronomical universe are apparent desperations and secret consolations. Time is the substance I am made of. Time is the river which sweeps me along, but I am the river. It is a tiger which destroys me, but I am the tiger. It is a fire which consumes me, but I am the fire." Maybe that's because he is a writer, and a writer whose stories always play with time and refuse to be tied down by it. In his stories and many others, whether a stranger comes to town or someone goes on a journey, their path is rarely straight. They often return transformed and transcendent, as we ourselves are when we read fantasy. While we're reading it, we can live forever. Thank you. I think we might have
so much, Sørina.
questions. Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
It was wonderful.
Let's need to try out these.